I'm here to talk about exclaves and enclaves of the United States of America. Not just at the national level, but also the state, county, and local levels. Even if you've heard of some of these, I hope I can teach you about a new one. Now, before I get into the main meat of this, I want to define a few terms. An enclave is a geographical entity that is within the borders of another territory. For example, Region B is inside Region A here. This can happen at any level of governance, as long as all regions in question are at the same level. There can also be multiple territories within one enclave. B and C border each other, but are still located within Region A. An exclave is a piece of land separated from the mainland by other political entities. Exclaves can also be enclaves, but it's not necessary. Now, islands for the most part are not considered exclaves, unless they are separated by territorial waters on all sides that are part of a different region. There are also a couple of subtypes of exclaves. Semi-exclaves are separated from the mainland by land, but still don't have a coastline and aren't surrounded on all sides. Pene-exclaves are also known as functional exclaves, because while there might not be a break in the borders, they are virtually inaccessible without crossing through another territory. Starting out with the national level, the first exclave I'll be talking about is the largest semi-exclave in the world, that of course being Alaska. It is a semi-exclave due to its separation from the rest of the US, having a land border with Canada, but still having a coastline. I'm sure most everyone watching this knows where Alaska is, so I'll talk a little bit about how Alaska became part of the US. Before the US claimed Alaska, it was under Russian control. Russia had first started colonizing Alaska in the 1700s and would send missionaries over in addition to the fur trappers in the region. Then Russia claimed sovereignty over it in 1821, but only had about 700 people there to enforce that claim. In fact, it was once referred to as Siberia's Siberia by archaeologist Ty Delaplane, since it was so hard to control it was at risk of falling into the hands of the British, who still had a presence in nearby Canada. Plus, the California Gold Rush showed evidence that there could be similar resources in Alaska, which would lead to a large influx of Americans and Canadians. So Alaska was sold to the US in 1867, and it wasn't a state for almost 100 years, as it wasn't granted statehood until 1959. Speaking of Alaska, Hyder is a town near the Canadian border in the panhandle of Alaska, which is only accessible via car through Canada. Although it is accessible via seaplane, it does function as a semi-exclave, getting most of its services from nearby Stewart, British Columbia. In fact, it is not required to report to a Border Patrol official to cross into Hyder from Canada. The town is also extremely small, having a population of 48 as of the 2020 census. For one more fun fact, it's also the easternmost town in Alaska. There's a similar situation in Maine. Located at the northernmost point of Maine, Escort Station is only reachable by road via Quebec. And speaking of northernmost points, it's time for one of the most well-known border oddities of the United States, the Northwest Angle. Located in northern Minnesota, this patch of remote forest is part of the US because of a map-making era a long time ago. Unlike most semi-exclaves, this one doesn't operate as an exclave year-round because in the winter, Lake of the Woods freezes over, allowing for the creation of an ice road. How this oddity came to be was the result of a map-making error. When defining the border between Canada and the US out west, they decided at a certain point anything north of the 49th parallel would be Canada and anything south would be the US. They're also not aware of the full shape of Lake of the Woods, the lake that the angle is adjacent to. They also thought at the time this is where the Mississippi's headwaters were. So then they drew the line straight south from here until the 49th parallel, and to the west would be the US-Canada border until the coast. The idea is that they would follow the Mississippi River up to the headwaters and then draw down from there, unaware that this chunk of land was here. And since they weren't aware that the Northwest Angle was there, the line was drawn anyways, and then once they found out about it, they're like, well, that's how it is, part of the US. But what's it like actually traveling to the angle? Well, starting from Warroad, Minnesota, which is already quite far north and out of the way, first you travel a little bit north to cross into Manitoba, and the Border Patrol agent looks at you strange when you say you're just there to visit the northernmost point of the contiguous US. Then it's an hour-long drive through Manitoba, depending on how much construction there is. There's only one community between here and the angle, that being Sprague. Then at some point the road becomes unpaved, and it's the dustiest road I have ever seen, but is somehow smoother than driving on the paved road. Where most border crossings would have some sort of outpost with a Border Patrol agent, here there's just a few signs letting you know you have arrived in Minnesota and need to check in with customs at Jim's Corner. After continuing to drive down this dusty trail, you arrive at an intersection with a large dirt lot and phone booth. This is the fabled Jim's Corner. Nowadays, there's the option to download an app rather than calling in the phone booth to let customs know you've arrived. Then you can finally reach the northernmost point of the contiguous US. Or at least the buoy that represents it. The northernmost point is actually up here. In fact, this isn't even the northernmost point easily reachable by car, but whatever. Most of the facilities up here are catered to people who are going out into Lake of the Woods for fishing. It's about 150 people who live in the Angle year-round, most of them in the settlement of Angle Inlet. While the Angle might not seem that big on the map, the amount of wilderness here is absurd. It really feels bigger than you'd anticipate. Then, in order to go back in the US, you gotta do all the border stuff on the app again, drive through Manitoba, visit a border crossing station that's way larger than the one in Canada, and finally you're back in mainland US. You can also take a boat, but there's not really a public option available. You could probably find someone who'll take you there, though. I don't know. Also in the same lake, there's a lesser mentioned exclave, Elm Point. It's not mentioned because there's nothing there. It extends south of the 49th parallel, much like our next exclave, Point Roberts, Washington. This town in Washington also came about as a result of the deal with the 49th parallel, only this time rather than being on a lake, it's on the edge of the coast. Another chunk of land that was unknown to be below the 49th parallel, since it's still within territorial waters, is also not a true exclave, but it is much more of a functional one, seeing as there's no ferry service between it and mainland Washington, and the water never freezes over. There's about 1,200 people who live there, and it seems like a standard Washington community. Except for when someone needs something found outside their small community, it can't be handled in Canada. It's about a 40-minute drive to the closest border crossing, then the time it takes to get through there, which can vary greatly due to being the main crossing between Seattle and Vancouver. That's just to reach the closest town of Blaine. It's another 30 to Bellingham. There is a school in Point Roberts, but it's only kindergarten through 3rd grade. Any higher, and families have to look somewhere else. There's some children who take a school bus to Blaine every day. Others are homeschooled, and some go to school in Canada in the nearby community of Tsawwassen. Personal note, I feel like this would be a terrible place to raise a child. Also, many of the problems living in a community isolated from the mainland US were exacerbated by COVID, and trying to cross an international border daily became a huge concern, especially since there isn't a pharmacy in Point Roberts, and even if there was, getting supplies there would be extreme hassle. Also, one of the articles called it this, which seems a little rude. Point Roberts and the Northwest Angle are decently known border anomalies, but did you know that Canada has its own version of those? Well, this might not be an exclave of the US, it's on the US border, so I thought I'd mention it. This is Akwesasne in Quebec on the border with New York. The Alberg Peninsula in Vermont isn't really an exclave at all due to the invention of the bridge, but the only land connection to this part of Vermont has is in Quebec. However, there's a teeny tiny little peninsula over here called Province Point that is more of a semi-exclave. While this might not be an exclave, there is a building on the Vermont-Quebec border that acts as one. The Haskell Free Library and Opera House can only be entered through the US, but the building crosses over the border into Canada. So Canadians must first cross into the US in order to enter this building. However, there are emergency exits into Canada. There are also several islands in rivers and lakes that are split up by the border, creating penne exclaves for both countries, but I don't think any of them that notable here to mention. I also should mention the 173 embassies scattered around the world. Since embassies count as foreign soil and maintain the laws of the home country, they're kind of like miniature exclaves all around the world. As well as the several military bases not located on US soil. Again, not really a traditional exclave, but I mean, it's pretty much just a colony of the US, surrounded by foreign soil. Now there are 128. Damn. Located outside the US's borders. Anyways, moving on down to the state level, starting off with one you've heard of but might not have known was an exclave. Liberty Island is an exclave of New York that is enclaved by the waters of New Jersey. The border between New York and New Jersey runs roughly down the middle of the New York harbor, and the Statue of Liberty just so happens to be on the Jersey side. But America's most iconic landmark can't be in New Jersey? In all seriousness, the debate on the border between New York and New Jersey existed long before the Statue of Liberty arrived on the island. Before it was known as Liberty Island, it was called Bedloe Island. Then, when the border between New Jersey and New York was moved to be halfway between the shores of the states, there were clauses that kept Bedloe and Ellis Islands as part of New York. That's right, Ellis Island is also an exclave of New York. Some land has been added to these islands, and New Jersey has argued that the original clauses only applied to the natural sections of the islands. So, part of the islands do belong to New Jersey. Continuing with the water theme, the Mississippi's flow changes all the time, creating several instances of penne exclaves along the banks of the river, where the state boundaries still match the old path of the river. Most of these are just rural land with nothing of note, but there are a couple of exceptional cases, like Kaskaskia, the first capital of Illinois, which is now an island only reachable through Missouri. The Mississippi River used to flow on the complete other side of town. This change in course was caused by major flooding due to deforestation in the area, leading to the Kaskaskia River being overrun by the Mississippi. This wasn't the only flood, and continuous flooding led to most of the residents relocating to nearby towns. At its peak, it had a population of about 7,000. As of the 2020 census, its population was 21. It is the third least populated incorporated municipality in Illinois. Now, as I mentioned earlier, it was indeed the first capital of Illinois. However, that lasted only a year, and the capital was moved to Vandalia long before any major flooding. And before that, it was the capital of the Illinois Territory. The westernmost part of Kentucky is the Kentucky Bend, also known as the New Madrid Bend, Bessie Bend, or Bubble Land. This is a true exclave of Kentucky, completely separated from the mainland of the state and surrounded on all sides by either Tennessee or Missouri. Apparently, there's no official explanation for why the Bend is part of Kentucky, although if I may take an educated guess, they drew a state line for the border here and said something like, everything north of this line until it reaches the Mississippi River belongs to Kentucky. And then the line crosses Mississippi twice and they're like, that part is also Kentucky. As of the last census, there were 9 people living here. Apparently there used to be hundreds, but basically every establishment here is shut down, as is the story with most of these little exclaves. Looks interesting on the map, but there's not much going on the ground. People also moved away due to, floods. Kind of a common theme. Of course, the Mississippi isn't the only river responsible for strange borders. The Missouri has several similar situations switching shores separating sets of citizens. citizens. Alright, that's a bit of an exaggeration as there's only one where people actually live, that being Carter Lake, Iowa, which is a Penne exclave only accessible by driving through Omaha. It's the only city in Iowa west of the Missouri and has a population of about 3,800. The reason for being an exclave is pretty similar to Kaskaskia. There was a flood and the river changed course. This time there's an oxbow lake left behind, which is the namesake of the town, Carter Lake. Its only claim to fame really is being on the other side of the Missouri, and it's pretty run-of-the-mill suburb of Omaha. And to wrap up the rivers portion, how about a border anomaly right before the river reaches the ocean? The Delaware River, which flows into the Delaware Bay, is the border between New Jersey and Delaware, for the most part. While it might not look like Delaware and New Jersey share a land border, if you look closely, you can see that portions on the eastern side of the river are part of Delaware. These exist because rather than being split down the middle for the entirety of the river, Delaware's borders extend to the edge of New Jersey, specifically the mean of the low water mark of the river, so a decent chunk of land belongs to Delaware on that side of the river, although for the most part, it's just some slivers of shore. Also, you could find functional exclaves along most state borders that have river boundaries, like Oklahoma and Texas with the Red River. Moving away from rivers and onto peninsulas, starting off with Michigan's Upper Peninsula, which is of course separated from the mainland and borders Wisconsin. Although before the Mackinac Bridge was ready, it was a Penne exclave for a long time. Now it's not really an exclave, but I gotta mention it. But why is this chunk of land part of Michigan and not Wisconsin? Well, back when Michigan was a territory, it was in a feud with Ohio, known as the Toledo War, which calling it a war seems like a bit of a stretch, but Michigan and Ohio both wanted Toledo. Actually, a piece of land called the Toledo Strip, not just Toledo. As a compromise proposed by Congress, Michigan would lose the Toledo Strip, but be granted all of the Upper Peninsula. This same deal also gave Michigan statehood. It's a win-win, since the UP is beautiful and they don't have Toledo. I'm sorry if anyone's from Toledo, I'm sure it's fine, maybe, I don't know. Sticking with Michigan peninsulas, this one acts as an actual exclave. Another semi-exclave here, the Lost Peninsula, is located in the southeast of the state along the border with Ohio. Once again, drawing a border at a specific degree of latitude is the region for a Penne exclave's creation. This was another consequence of the Toledo War. As far as what goes on here, not a lot. There's about 150 people living there. It's a 6-minute drive to mainland Michigan. The next peninsula is a somewhat obscure portion of Virginia known as the Eastern Shore. It's the southern end of the Delmarva Peninsula and gives it the final syllable of the name. Before 1964, when the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel was completed, it operated as a Penne exclave of Virginia, with the typical way to reach it being a ferry or to go the long way around through Maryland. It's mostly an agricultural region as well as being an excellent area to harvest seafood. And kind of interesting, the most populated city in the area, Chincoteague, isn't even on the peninsula but instead on a nearby island. These are some other communities I believe to act as functional exclaves. Even though they are 100% within the territory of their state and aren't separated by any water or political boundaries, they are almost inaccessible from the rest of their states due to harsh terrain. Cook City and Silvergate are two communities in Montana near the Wyoming border. There are no roads you can take there that won't involve passing through Wyoming. It is possible to hike through the surrounding Beartooths, but these are some of the tallest mountains in Montana, and it'd be difficult in the summer and near impossible in the winter. Since it's so difficult to access via conventional means, I think it does act as an exclave. Located on the other side of the Tetons in Wyoming, Alta is only easily accessed through Idaho, once again for similar reasons. I could find no evidence of a road that connects Navajo Mountain to the rest of Utah, although there are probably some dirt trails that do, but from the mapped roads I saw, all of them went through Arizona. The main part of the town of Chatham, New Hampshire is only reachable by driving through Maine. It looks like there's a road that connects to New Hampshire, however, yep, just barely doesn't. The town of Ringe also has a small Penne exclave peninsula separated by Massachusetts. There are also many more slivers of states that can be accessed by traveling through bordering states, but it'd take too much time to cover them all. Now moving on to the county level, we won't be starting out with a county, but St. Martin Parish in Louisiana. Louisiana uses parishes instead of counties, don't worry about it. Anyways, this parish is split into two areas known as Upper and Lower St. Martin, Lower being the exclave I'll be discussing. As the story goes, the reason that Iberia Parish split St. Martin into is due to a surveying error, but some have their doubts. In the book A Narrative History of Borough Bridge, once called The Point, it stated that parts of St. Martin and St. Mary parishes were taken in order to create Iberia Parish, and that the land to the south was unwanted by Iberia, so then it remained as part of St. Martin. As for what's in Lower St. Martin, it's mostly rural, with the community of Bell River being partially located in the parish. Atacama's Island Wildlife Management Area is partially located in the lower region of the parish as well. Back to Alaska, which also doesn't use counties, but instead divide up into boroughs. One of these is the unorganized borough, which is in turn split up into many different census areas. Several of these census areas border each other and could be considered kind of a mainland unorganized borough, and then the other census areas could be exclaves, but this one's kind of iffy because like the census areas are kind of more of a county equivalent, and the unorganized borough is just kind of like, I don't know how to describe it. The way Alaska divides itself up is kind of weird. Now for some true counties with exclaves. Tennessee has two. Dixon County has an exclave in Cheatham County, which from what I can tell is there because the borders were changed to include the land of J.W. Simpkins in Dixon County. Then Loudoun County has two exclaves, or maybe three with this kind of quad point here. Couldn't find any information on why these exist. Probably something to do with shifting county borders and someone wanting to stay with Loudoun. In Georgia, Brooks County has a small exclave along the Florida border. Just guessing here, but I assume the decision for the county borders involved the Withlacoochee River and everything on one side was part of Brooks until the Florida border, but then it crosses over the border again, resulting in this. In Massachusetts, Norfolk County has two significant exclaves, the town of Brookline and Cohasset. When Norfolk County was created, the towns of Roxbury and Dorchester were originally part of it. Later, as Boston expanded, those towns became absorbed by Boston, and by default became part of Suffolk County. However, this fate didn't befall Brookline, leaving it separated from the rest of the county. A similar situation happened with Cohasset. However, the towns between it and the rest of Norfolk didn't want to be part of Norfolk when it was created and wished to be in Suffolk County. Now, they're in Plymouth County. In World War II, Los Alamos County was created as a federally managed county for the Manhattan Project. The land it was on took out parts of nearby counties, including Sandoval, which now has a small triangle of land separated from it. Denver is a consolidated city county, where the limits of the city are 1-to-1 with the limits of the county. Now, you may have noticed this map here that there are a couple of gaps here. These are exclaves of Arapahoe County enclaved within Denver County. One is of the city of Glendale, and the other is Holly Hills, which is a census-designated place. The city formed in 1952 out of fear of being annexed by Denver. To quote the Glendale City website, it was a fear of a giant, fear of Denver's annexation, a fear of the loss of independence. The other islands in Denver were just never annexed for similar reasons, the people not wanting to become part of the city. This does mean that they still get their county services from Arapahoe County, which is like a whole thing. Broomfield also has a similar situation, being a consolidated city county where there are parts of nearby counties enclaved within it due to its weird borders. In a similar vein, every city in Virginia is what's known as an independent city. In short, this means they operate at both the city and county level. It's debatable on whether or not these count as enclaves since they aren't technically counties, but they do operate at the county level and oftentimes they are surrounded by another county. In total, there are 14 of these independent cities, which are enclave counties. Sometimes the county and city will share the same name. For example, Roanoke is enclaved by Roanoke County. The city of Salem also borders Roanoke in the same enclave. Additionally, Fairfax County has an exclave of the county within the city of Fairfax, which houses the county courthouse and similar government buildings. It's a similar situation with Prince William County and Manassas. Montgomery County has an exclave in the bordering city of Radford, but Radford isn't an enclave, and the exclave isn't for government facilities, it's for 3 houses. Because when Radford was annexing land, the people lived in those 3 houses at the time wanted to remain as part of Montgomery County, and they still are. Now we truly reach the city level of exclaves. Now it's really common for lots of cities to have chunks of land that are part of city limits but not connected to the main limits. US city limits are a strange beast. Now, most of these exclaves I don't think are worth mentioning individually, but San Diego is notable enough to mention since there's a pretty major chunk here to the south. This smaller region on the border of Mexico is known as South San Diego, and it's not a true exclave, weirdly enough, because there's a small strip of San Diego that runs through the bay. Technically not an exclave, but it's definitely functionally an exclave. This is part of San Diego because San Isidro was running out of water, so they agreed to be annexed by San Diego to be allowed access to their water supply. Then the land around there being annexed by San Diego continued to grow. Also here I should define another term, census-designated place. This is a community recognized on a census, has census data, but doesn't have an incorporated government, and is usually separate from nearby cities and towns. A notable example is East Los Angeles, and I'll usually use the acronym CDP to refer to them. There are many metropolitan areas in the US with cities located inside cities, or some other form of community such as a town, village, or CDP. I won't be mentioning anything in this section that isn't at least a CDP, so sometimes there are just neighborhoods that aren't incorporated, but they're not even like on the census. Starting off, Los Angeles has a few cities and communities enclosed within its borders. Most notable is Beverly Hills. But why is Beverly Hills not part of Los Angeles? This story here applies to a lot of other enclave cities as well. A new city forms by the near one. In this case, Beverly Hills was where actors lived starting back in the time before there were really any film stars. Since it was the start of the film industry, it's kind of just like a scrubby area outside LA. Early on though, Beverly Hills was running out of water, and they could have just joined the city of LA to have the city's water, but instead remained independent for more control. Eventually, Los Angeles got so big and incorporated so much land that they just surrounded all of Beverly Hills. And this is how the story goes. A new city gets formed, the main city grows big, a small city says, I think we're better off on our own, and then the main city grows around. Now, while it isn't the case for every enclave cities, a lot of them are very affluent. A lot of rich people just don't want to join the main city. This isn't true for all enclave cities, but it happens a decent amount. Now, Beverly Hills is also in the same enclave as West Hollywood. Interestingly enough, West Hollywood was unincorporated until 1984. All that stuff when Beverly Hills was considering becoming part of LA was happening in like the 30s. Neither Los Angeles or Beverly Hills claimed the land around it. So that can happen as well, just no large city wants to claim a chunk of land and then a city just kind of forms there. Funnily enough, there's also another Beverly Hills in Florida, which is also entirely surrounded by the community of Pine Ridge. While they're both census designated places and not incorporated, it's still an interesting parallel. Los Angeles has more than one pocket filled with cities though. There's also San Fernando and a 3-in-1 pocket with Culver City, Ladera Heights, and View Park, Windsor Hills. I'm not going to go cover the history of every single city within a city since stories are usually pretty similar. I'm just going to go over some major cities with cities enclaved inside their borders. Chicago has 2 located in one enclave with Norwich and Harwood Heights. Sometimes the main city of a metro area doesn't have a city enclaved within it, but a suburb will. For example, Beaverton, Oregon has Cedar Hills, which is broken up into 4 main parts. Also, I lied. Turns out Portland does have an enclave. It's just very small. It's Maywood Park over here. There's a similar situation with Sandy, Utah, where it's far from the largest city in the state, but it also is the only one with another city enclaved inside it, which is kind of odd. This also happens all the time in Twin Cities burbs, where there's just like these large, blocky, rectangular cities that engulf just kind of like a small community off in the corner. San Jose has 2 communities within its borders. Fruitdale, which is a district of San Jose, but also part unincorporated and is also a CDP. Sometimes they overlap, it's weird. I wouldn't have mentioned these had it not been for the name of the other one being Burbank. That's right, there's another place in California named Burbank, and it's named after a completely different guy. Detroit has 2 cities encapsulated, Highland Park, and one of my favorite city names in the US, Hamtramck. Moving on to Texas, which as a state has the second highest amount of enclave cities. Austin has 3 cities and 2 CDPs. San Antonio has 10. Houston has quite a few cities located within its boundaries. I believe it's 9. Why am I using uncertain language? I mean, look at these boundaries. It's hard to tell if something is actually fully enclosed or not. Would you believe me if I told you there was yet another city named Beverly Hills enclave within another city? Of course you would. Why else would I ask that? The city of Beverly Hills, Texas is surrounded entirely by Waco. That's 3. Absurd. Moving on to the DFW area, Dallas has 3 enclave cities. However, Fort Worth has a mix of 11 cities and towns, the most egregious of which is Lakeside. Like, look at this. Look at this boundary. And even Arlington joins in with 2 enclave cities of its own. But the king of them all is Louisville, which has 78 cities within its borders, and that number includes cities that are within cities within the limits of Louisville. And some tiny exclaves can have like 4 or 5 cities within them. And of course, there are enclave cities with their own exclaves. Now, Louisville is an example of a balance, which is a classification of consolidated city-county, where the main city in the county has a consolidated government with the county, but other cities still exist within the county. And there's a handful of these. But also, Louisville has its own city borders that are separate from the county borders, even though they're both, like, the same thing, kind of. Louisville is an extreme example of how many cities can fit within the boundaries of a balance. Most just have 1 or 2 within the border that are part of the county, but not the main city. The largest consolidated city-county, Butte, Montana, has limits congruous with Silver Bow County, save the small town of Walkerville. But there are other balances that have some impressive numbers. Both Indianapolis and Kansas City, Missouri have 12 enclave cities. Now, here's every US city I could find that has a whole city or town within its borders that I haven't mentioned earlier. I should also mention townships that enclave a borough or village or some other form of local government. Almost every state is divided up into counties, and then in some states the counties are divided up into townships. And it varies from state to state on how much like government these townships have. Like for some states I think it's just like a way to divide unincorporated land, and for some they are kind of incorporated, but they're still just kind of take up large chunks of rural areas. And I won't be covering them in detail since there are so many, and the story is pretty similar usually. New local government forms, declares independence from the surrounding township. Since townships cover a lot of land in certain states, this happens quite a bit. This happens a lot in New Jersey, but also happens in New York, although they're called towns, I'm pretty sure. As well as Pennsylvania, which has 338 enclaves at this level of local government. So yeah, I'm gonna wrap it up there, as covering each one of those would take way too long and would be very monotonous. Thanks for watching, hope you enjoyed this video. Like and subscribe if you did. Want to do more content like this? Yeah, check out the other Ocean Man social medias in the description below. I'm going with the 78 number because that's more sensational. I'm sorry if I mispronounced anything in this video. I'm sure people will be more than happy to correct me. Check out some more videos. I did a giant road trip around the United States called The Big Loop. Kind of my big project of the year, so check that out if you haven't already. Put a lot of effort into that. Yeah, see you later.